The First World War started in the summer of 1914, and what would follow over the next 4 years would so dramatically change the world that nobody would ever forget it. Up to that point, it was the deadliest war humanity has experienced, and up to today, we still live amongst the fields and valleys of those that fought in the critically acclaimed Great War. These are the stories of the soldiers who were willing to be slaughtered, not only for their countries, but for their families and friends. My name is Jacob Hayes, and I live in Dolphinholme, UK. This isn't a story about me, but one about my great-grandfather that fought as an artilleryman in World War I. I'm going to summarize the story according to how he wrote it in his diary. He took it with him to the war and wrote in it weekly. He has a few interesting but brutal stories to tell, but the one I wish to share still baffles me today, so without further ado, let's begin. Date: the 7th of August, 1914. I have reacquainted with my QF 18-pounder artillery piece for the past 2 days, and I'm currently in the process of loading the heavy devil onto our convoy that sets off for France soon. I'm planning on writing a letter to my mother as soon as our expedition reaches France. I don't want her to worry about me after all, for I know my training will certainly help me in this war we just declared on the Imperial German Empire. Date: the 14th of August, 1914. Our expeditionary force dispatched for France on the 9th of August, and today we finally landed in France. We now prepare to join the French artillerymen along the border of Belgium to help repel the German advance. I personally think that the rest of my mates and I are already prepared to fight, but one thing is for sure: we don't know what to expect when we get to that piece of land. August 21st, 1914. After 3 days of hiking through towns and cities in France, we reached the French and Belgian line, which stretched from Alsace-Lorraine in the east to Mons in southern Belgium. And what boosted not only my morale, but my mateys' morale as well, is that we were greeted with open arms among many French and Belgian people. We got our artillery pieces a few days ago, and yesterday we situated them a few kilometers back from our defensive line, about 5 to be exact. August 28, 1914. We received word on the 23rd of August from a Belgian runner that a German cavalry charge began on our defensive line, so we had our coordinates received via planner and began to open fire repeatedly on the destination chosen by the planner. My job that day was to load and unload shells inside our QF 18-pounder field gun that my mates and I nicknamed Shelly. It wasn't until the last shell our team fired that we saw what the Germanic artillery did to our line. We saw doctors, or might I say medics, carrying away soldiers on stretchers. Some were disfigured, and some of them I spotted were as red as the corpse of Christ Jesus as depicted in my church. The poor souls wheeled away, never to be seen by any of us here again. God, please look after those men in heaven, for they're more brave and done so much more than I ever could. I soon after looked at our artillery line, in which explosive residue from Imperial German artillery shells surrounded our position, or scored direct hits on some of our pieces. Some men in our line were in red meshed pieces, and I vomited twice that day, and I prayed that for the next day we wouldn't suffer through one death in our force. However, we did receive word from a runner that the Imperial German cavalry charge was pushed back. The next day, we were repelling a Germanic foot soldier charge, and we managed to push them back, but not without suffering some casualties of our own. This cycle repeated for a few days until today, where both a foot soldier and cavalry charge ensued, and we barely managed to hold our ground. I can't get this soldier's face out of my mind, for he handed me a canteen of water before his head was severed by a shell. It was absolutely awful, but we still hold. However, I don't know what tomorrow will hold, or even next week when I write again. The 4th of September, 1914. I don't have much time, but we have been pushed back after 3 repeated attacks from the Imperial German forces, and we began retreating to the border in between France and Belgium. It took a while, and the enemy was right behind our tails, harassing us as we fled, but I just finished praying to our Heavenly Father for our fellow mates, and I have just witnessed a miracle. I don't care if I'm called crazy, for if I am, I'll just have my mates back me up, because we just saw angels come down from the clouds and shooting blazing arrows among the Imperial German forces. We cheered and prayed to God, for we knew He was on our side. We thanked Him, and were able to flee this entire week without suffering a single casualty. As for today, we are almost to France, and I can't wait to get there. My name is Cyril Helm, and let me begin by saying that it all began so cheerfully, with gorgeous weather in which the troops were itching to join the great adventure abroad, for it was impossible not to be excited. Now, if you were part of my generation, you would understand why we were excited. It had nothing to do with patriotism or bravery for our country, but it was a chance to be more than the kids we used to be. We didn't realize until a few months later how long and brutal the war was going to be. Most of us, like myself, were still teenagers, and we thought this was a chance to grow up. But I now reflect on this as a poor choice we had made. My experience may be hard to tell due to my mentioning of our ages at the time, so please bear with me. So as our 2nd Battalion of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry began to set sail from Dublin for Le Havre on an old cargo ship, the SS Buttershire, on 14th of August 1914, a chorus of hoots and sirens filled the riverside air. Soon after, a large crowd bid us a noisy farewell, for we were now on our way. It felt like the realization of the dream of every young soldier. When we headed out into the open sea with our course set towards Land's End, a historical message is read out to all those on deck from King George V. "You are leaving home to fight for the safety and honor of my empire, and I pray God to bless you and guard you and bring you back victorious." Just 2.5 months later, I would be writing in daily diary format in my standard issue Army Book 129. During that time, I was holed up in a farm in northeastern France. I have chosen the spot as my main aid post, just outside a tiny village called Richebourg-Alvaux. The battalion I came here with was already severely depleted. The retreat from Mons in August and early September and the subsequent race to the sea has taken a terrible toll. Now that I think about it, hell would be a tame word described to what we went through so far. On the 27th of October, German shells were raining down around the farm just 100 yards behind one of our first constructed British fire trenches, and I was struggling to cope with the wounded as they flooded in. In the garden behind the farm, British and German dead were laid out waiting to be buried as soon as the shelling died down in the evening. Many of those shells fell in our frontline trenches, causing awful casualties. Men were buried alive, whilst others were just dug out in time and brought to, unable to stand with their backs half broken. My cellar was soon packed, but I couldn't put any wounded upstairs, for at any minute the place could have been blown up. My work was dressing the injured, and it was so relentless and intense that, at times, it took my mind off the horrors unfolding outside. But every so often, when I would pause to listen, the noise almost shattered my nerves. Unimaginable is how I would describe my feelings at such moments. At times, there was nothing my mind knew more than to sit and listen to the shells outside and wonder how long it will be before one comes and finds my hiding place. Surprisingly, the farm survived the German shell fire of the 27th of October, but the next day at noon it started up again. Somehow that morning I found time to write a letter home to my parents. I thanked them for a thermos flask they sent me through the military post, and I wrote how sorry I was not to have written for a few days. The reason I told them was because of the rather trying situation the battalion had found itself in. On the 28th, we were experiencing more than a nightmare, for the crumps were coming just over and then short until 1200, when there was a blinding flash and a roar. The next thing I knew was that I was leaning up against a wall in pitch darkness with the air full of dust and acrid fumes. A shell had bursted by the cellar where I was working. 6 lay dead about the cellar and many wounded. One poor RAMC orderly who had been standing next to me when the shell burst was lying dead with his chest smashed in by a huge fragment of shell. Now that's something I don't like to even think or talk about. The next day we saw less shelling, but for me it was no less painful. By this time, 11 weeks into their war, I and the quartermaster, who worked well behind the front line, were the only 2 officers remaining from those who had set sail from Dublin in August. 300 men had died in the previous 9 days, and it was horrible. It's appalling seeing one's friend picked off one after the other, and I can only marvel now that I survived. At times, when I realized all those my pals had gone, I nearly went off my head. But if it wasn't for my family being my link to sanity, I would probably have been shell-shocked like the rest of the boys. The next day, 29th of October, I was wounded and unable to rejoin the fight, so was sent back home and greeted by my family with open arms. Now, for those who see this, I hope you understand how much the boys that served with me did for our motherland of Britain, and I pray that you give them your thanks, for they have given the biggest sacrifice that man could give, their lives. My father was known in the service documents as Francis Harold McLorg, but as we knew him, he was Frank. As my mother knew him, he had a secret sort of name that she had given him early in the war when they first met, and it was Jamie, James, or Jim. Sometimes people get confused about who this man is. He signs his war letters as Jimmy when he's writing to her, but in fact most of his letters, at least to his family at home, are signed by Frank. He was born in Moosomin, Saskatchewan, which was then Moosomin, Northwest Territories, in 1890. He moved to Saskatoon and then quickly to Winnipeg as part of the pre-going overseas experience of getting trained to be a medic in Canada for the war. He joined as a private in 1915 and was quickly made into a corporal, then swiftly into a lance corporal during training, in which gave him an extra 10 cents in pay. When he arrived to France, he said he had to somehow supervise the soldiers and French citizens in the sick bay, and they were all very sick with fits of flu, bronchitis, and pneumonia, and so forth. Then, of course, his mother was worried about him, so she sent him a letter to see if he's using the right kind of medicine and taking care of himself. He replied, "I'm so sorry should I have caused you any fear by even mentioning my position as a sick supervisor. I quite understand if you were worried, and also any rumor of our team being quarantined, which would have had you considerably more worried. We haven't been quarantined as of yet, and I don't for a moment believe we're going to be, and we've heard lots of rumors when we'll be sent over to the front, of course." He then goes on to say that he's absolutely delighted with the group of men that he's been working with. Eventually, he got to see his cousin enter the bay due to a case of pneumonia. His cousin was with a Scottish division, and while they saw each other there, they would compare notes between one another. Upon reading one of his cousin's letters, he questioned him about the Canadian division he was serving along the side of during the Second Battle of Ypres by asking him, "Are the Canadians really undisciplined?" And his cousin's response to that was, "Yes, they were, of course. They weren't the kind to stand around with parade stuff, but when they have to work to do, and they see the reason for it, they really don't complain at all. For when we went over the top, they didn't really complain, for they had the intelligence to realize that this is necessary work, and as long as the next man does his share, they do not kick at all, and I love them for it. I honestly think they're as good as any there are, and better than 90% of us in our division." His cousin speaks like this all the way through, about the people he's worked with and how he really clearly enjoyed them, but he eventually died of his pneumonia, for it became too severe and that messed Frank up a good bit. He sent home a field postcard to his family in Saskatchewan on the 10th of November 1915, and by scratching out the statements they did not apply to him, he was able to show his family he was quite well. However, he had to tell them the bad news about his cousin's death. Soon after, Frank was sent to the front, not before he was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant on the 9th of January, 1916. After this, Frank sent another letter to his family in which he described how he was promoted, and then how complicated and difficult tasks involved in building and maintaining trenches were, for as a second lieutenant, he was responsible for overseeing the process. However, he admired his men for their hard work, but he wouldn't see many of them again, for they all would eventually go over the top because the trench he was helping to build was at the Somme River Valley. He didn't talk much about that battle, for it was one of the deadliest battles of the war, as I found out later in my own life, and the only thing he could ever tell me about the battle was that he was wounded in his left arm by shrapnel and was taken to a field hospital after being brought back to his own trench line by one of his fellow servicemen. Upon his arrival to receive amputation, he commented on the many from his unit who have been killed by sadly announcing, "Many mothers' hearts are breaking for their boys who will never return." His treatment was long, and it wouldn't be without a strong argument to stay with his brigade, for he did lose an arm, and there weren't too many ways to fight with one arm. However, he just wasn't going to let that stand in his way, so he vouched, and I quote, "to serve and defend my brothers in arms until the German army gives this war up, or we breach the Hindenburg line, or even Berlin itself, and make them give up." He was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant on the 9th of June 1918 upon returning to the front, and he eventually led his brigade in the 100 Days offensive all the way to the armistice. I am going to finish Frank's legacy as a soldier with a quote from one of his last letters he sent to his family. This one was written about the brigade he had led the charge with during the 100 Days offensive, and eventually that same man, my father, led those men all the way through to the armistice. I would not swap the brigade for any other in the world, and I honestly believe that these fellow countrymen of mine are as good as any there are. To my dearest family, Toronto, 14th of January 1916. I left Ridgetown, Ontario in January 1916 at the age of 19 to join the 48th Highlanders, so Lawrence and I went down to the armories last night. Just as we got there, we met a Highlander officer. I told him we wanted to join the 134th, and he said, "Come right along with me." Suddenly he looked up at me and said, "Say, how tall are you? We can't take any more under 5'5". I told him I couldn't quite do it, but I showed him a letter which I had received from Colonel Donald, saying that if a man was specially well built, he would stretch a point in his favor. "Well," he said, "you certainly deserve some consideration under the circumstances, and you're well built, all right." He took my measure, and I just went 5'4½", but he let my hair stand up, and it just stood high enough to touch the scale at 5'5". Well, he thought that would do if I could pass examination, but the worst blow came this morning when I went down to be examined. When I entered the room, another officer said, "Say, how tall are you?" I answered quite confidently, 5'5". He wouldn't allow for my hair, and with my low-heeled shoes on, I just touched 5'3 3/4. "See that?" he said. "I'm sorry, but we can't take you. You're too short." My heart dropped right down to my boots, and I thought it was all over, but I produced the letter again. The officer took me in to see the commander. He joked about the matter for a while, but finally he said that he'd put a pair of high-heeled shoes on me, and he would add my height to my friend's and divide it by 2 and make up for my deficiency in that way. In my bare feet, I stand 5'2½". Rome, 28th of November, 1917. I made my first trip into the trenches at Vimy Ridge, and for mud that piece of line had them all beat. I fired my first shot the second night just after midnight. I got the fellow I shot at just in front of our wire. I won't forget the feeling as I pressed the trigger that night, and I hadn't got over it when I wrote. On the 27th of February, 14 Fritz raided our machine gun post, and yours truly was on sentry. It was an awfully dark night. Of course, it was too late to fire the gun, but some way or another I managed to alarm the rest of the crew, and we beat them off. The joke of it all was I received a bunch of daily mails from home a few weeks later, and on the front page of one was a full account of the whole thing. I bet Mother dreamed that little Leslie was the sentry she was reading about. The second time I went over was at Vimy on the 9th of April. That was a great day for the Canucks, and it was then I had my first real go at Fritz. However, I wasn't able to see if we had reached their lines, for my left leg was blown off by shrapnel. But don't worry, for I have a ton of wrappings on it and the doc says I'll be out soon. So you see, we've had quite an exciting time of it all year, and I consider myself extremely lucky to still be breathing, and hopefully Mom will cry, for my war is over, and I'll be coming home as soon as the doc is finished with my wound. Wishing you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I remain, yours sincerely, Leslie. I am Dr. Charles James McNeil Willoughby, and I graduated from medicine in 1916 from Toronto Medical School. I was very anxious to join the war effort, so I joined the British Medical Corps in 1916 in England and was sent in the hospital ship Shatt al-Arab to Basra in order to serve in the Mesopotamian campaign. I had not one type of training in tropical diseases. Malaria and dysentery, both amoebic and bacillary, were common, but the treatments for those sicknesses were disappointing, and casualties were heavy from such diseases. I finally got to France in 1917, first of all on hospital ship. From the hospital ship, I went into a ground situation. I don't like to talk about the trench warfare during our advance in France, but I recall seeing a famous, bizarre-painted Richthofen circus, then under the leadership of Hermann Göring. It was flying very low over our dressing station, which was a shed near a farmhouse. We were using this place as our temporary battalion headquarters. The flying circus was apparently on a scouting mission to see how far we had advanced before evening. This suspicion was soon to be confirmed, for on my return to the dressing station, I found no patients needing attention, so I went over to the old adjoining farmhouse for evening mess. It was then that the shelling began from the German batteries in our area. Unfortunately, one large shell landed on the dressing station, which caused it to be completely demolished, and my orderly who was there did not survive. The roof collapsed, and that registered a nice dent on my helmet, but I was otherwise unharmed. Everybody thought everything in warfare is subject to various dangerous experiences, and I readily admit that I was a coward when it came to real shell fire. How some of the more seasoned officers and men treated the whine and the bang of shells bursting around with callous indifference was beyond my comprehension, until I learned their philosophy was that you never hear a shell with your number on it. Those with the whine and the bang are marked for someone else. I wrote often to my family while I was overseas. I was the censor for my unit, so I was very careful, and not only my own letters, but with everyone else's. However, I did manage to communicate well with my family, for I wrote a letter to my father on the 19th of July in 1918, wishing him a happy birthday, and told him that morale among the men of my unit was high. The experience of the war has never left me, and I really felt dearly for the freedom and peace around the world after the war was over. My name is Malcolm Fraser, and this story is about my father, Thomas Marion, in which, as far as he's concerned, he enlisted when he was 17 in the 73rd Battalion of the Black Watch in 1916. He explained how he came down from his postal office, which is where he worked, when he spotted officers who fought at the Plains of Abraham, and they wrote a letter that contained a star when my father enlisted, in which the letter stated that they had taken on a recruit of historic connections. My dad figured they did that for publicity to get people to join the army. After applying, he served at Linz, Passchendaele, and Cambrai. He talked very, very little about the war. However, he did manage to tell me some stories about his time in it. The first story he told me was that his battalion was watching a dogfight over the trenches, and the German plane was brought down, which boosted the morale of the entire battalion he was in. Upon going to investigate the wreckage, they found the pilot of the plane was alive and crying. His platoon then captured him, and my father never knew what became of him. Later he told me about the 73rd's first attack at Vimy Ridge, which was a March trench raid that occurred after the dogfight. The 73rds went over the top and got beaten up pretty badly. During his explanation of the raid was when he told me about the one and only death he was willing to share with anyone, and I can understand why he only explained one of them. I still picture how he described this poor soul's death in my dreams to this day. He explained how the soldier in front of him was cut in half by an artillery shell and his small intestine landed on my father's rifle. My father always cried when he told us this. The 73rd's charge was pushed back, and later in the night, when they were coming back to their own trench, they could hear soldiers shouting, "Help 73rd! Help 73rd!" They're all tied up in the barbed wire, and the 73rd Battalion both couldn't and were forbidden to get to them, and I know that bothered my father immensely. His battalion eventually took Vimy Ridge with assistance from the Canadians, and after that he was transferred to the 85th Battalion, which was a Nova Scotia regiment. I don't think he was too pleased about that, to leave all of his friends. I know I wouldn't be pleased. After his transfer, the war was dragging on to an end, and he was mainly out on patrols then. I always asked him if he had seen any Germans on some of his patrols, and he responded, "Yes, this one night I saw half a dozen of them, and they were 10 feet tall with Bertha-sized guns." This was my father's way of letting me know that he wasn't going to talk any further. By the time the war ended in 1918, he came home shell-shocked, and this was a worry to his 3 sisters, but it especially broke his mother's heart because they never knew where he was, for he would wander all around town. He eventually began to put the war behind him by the 1930s to eventually live a recollected and decent life. Father, I thank you for serving our family and our country of Scotland in that time of war. Before the start of World War I, Norman McHolden came to Enfield, Nova Scotia to work for Jack Horn. He enlisted to serve in the war effort and named Enfield as his place of residence. Norman, no doubt, was the same as many who served in World War I. He felt he would be gone for a few months, the job would be done, and he would return to his normal life. Norman served with the 85th Battalion of the Canadian Infantry Nova Scotia Regiment and was killed in action on October 30th, 1917, near Ypres, Belgium. He has no known grave, which was the byproduct of the type of trench warfare that soldiers experienced in World War I. At different battles, so many lives were lost that it was hard to be able to keep clear records of burial sites. The weather often worked against proper burials, and the mud that ensued was dreadful. In Ypres, Belgium, there is a memorial called the Menin Gate. Listed on this memorial are the names of soldiers like Norman McHolden, who has no known grave. An arched monument over the main road greets travelers in and out of the city. This memorial holds the names of approximately 62,000 names of members of the infantry that have no known graves from World War I. Each night since November 11th, 1918, the local fire department stops traffic at 8 p.m. and has a service of remembrance. Only twice during World War II was this service missed due to them being in action during the fighting in this area. The people have a great gratitude for the sacrifice these men and women made for their liberation. Soon the French themselves would need liberating again, for the second deadliest war in the history of the world was arising. World War II was the deadliest war in all of history. It grew out of ancient and unordinary feelings: anger, vigilance, the lust for power, and the thirst for revenge of the victors of World War I. But it ended because of courage, perseverance, selflessness, and the hunger for freedom, in which all of it was linked with the unimaginable chaos and brutality in order to change the course of human events and history. World War II showed the best and the worst of humankind in a generation. In the slaughter that coveted the world, over 70 million people died, so many and in so many different places that the real number of casualties will never be determined. However, half of those that perished in the killings that engulfed the world were civilians. Innocent men, women, and children were obliterated by the horrors of war. More than 85 million men and women served in uniform. But without the sacrifice of those men and women in uniform, the war's outcome would have been completely different. The following stories are from those that were in service during World War II, and how that cataclysmic event changed their lives. My name is Charles Valima. I was born and raised in Brandon, Wisconsin, and my parents are Pete and Tina Valima. I have 2 younger sisters, Alice and Florence. I went to Westbrick School in the town of Springvale. Then I went to Willow Creek in the town of Waupun. I graduated from 8th grade and then worked on the farm I lived in. Till I was about 18, worked with my dad. And then I think I went to the shoe factory, Ideal Shoe Factory in Waupun. Worked for a board at home and worked in the shoe factory from 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. Whatever, 13 cents an hour. No, $13 a week was paid. I soon had to register for the draft, in 38 I guess it was, and then I was drafted on July 29th. There were 4 boys from Waupun that went from Waupun to Milwaukee. Their names are Glenn Town and Ben Lumens and Ken Coleman. I went by bus to Milwaukee, and there we were examined and had to pass a physical. Kenny Coleman, who was probably the one that wanted to go in the service the most, he didn't pass the physical, so he went back to Waupun and the rest of us went. I was drafted from 1941 to 1945. I was in the infantry, so I went to infantry training. I think maybe Ben Lumens became a policeman when he came home because I think he was in the military police during the service. As for Glenn Town, he must have been a truck driver because he was a truck driver back in civilian life. I had basic training in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I remember hearing about Pearl Harbor when I was in the barracks. It was on Sunday about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, North Carolina time. We had an old radio. The barracks were new, but they were built like a barn. They had like a beam that ran from end to end about 6-8 inches wide, and we had an old radio. The plastic cover was all off of it, so we just had the tubes. Mostly everybody was gone on Sunday. I remember being in there, and then news came over that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, so that kind of changed the picture because the next morning, all these older men, about 34 years older and up that were in service, they had their bags all packed, and they were going to go home Monday morning, so when they were released for home, that was quite a commotion. I guess eventually they didn't leave, but I don't know, they were released after maybe a year or so. After Pearl Harbor, we stayed at Fort Bragg and kept training in Fort Bragg. By that time, we were put in divisions, regular Army divisions, and Fort Bragg was the 9th Infantry Division. That's where I was in, the 47th Infantry Regiment, I guess they called it. The 9th Division was the whole thing and included all the rifle and artillery and tank platoons. We had lots of training because first we thought we were going to be in half tracks. This was before Pearl Harbor. Then they switched us from that to landing craft. So we had the big rope ladders on the 50-foot board wall. We had to climb up and down that till you could do it pretty good, up and down, because that is the same thing that we had when we got off the ship. So we did lots of training. We went through Virginia, the beaches off Virginia, and what is the Chesapeake Bay. Soon after, I went to Camp Grant, Illinois. From there, I went to Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia. This was in the end of July, so you can imagine the temperature in Macon, Georgia at the time. I think we all lost a few pounds in a hurry. We sweat day and night. There we had a lot of close order drills, and we finally got to use rifles and all of that. For weapons training, we had the 03 first bolt-action Springfield like they used in World War I, but we would later receive the 45 and the M1 Grand. We were mostly a rifle platoon, for we had 3 rifle platoons in the company total, and then the last company had a large platoon, so they had a few machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns to be exact, and they also had some mortars. In a rifle platoon, we just had rifles and revolvers. That's when the Grand came out, in which I think is the most amazing rifle ever designed by man. We had lots and lots of target practice. All day long we had a box of ammunition, so you could just shoot all day long at targets. We really learned how to use a rifle. In November of 42, we landed in North Africa. It took us 21 days, and what they did with the whole army was give them all the equipment that we needed, all the supplies that we needed. For I don't know how many days, all the ammunition, all the food was on. I think it was some 200 ships that was in this flotilla. and this was right in the thick of the German submarine warfare that was going on. And we could go all day long, for we'd be going until sun would set, get up the next morning, then all day long we'd go with the sun behind us. They just did that. They said we zigzagged for 21 days so the enemy never was sure where we were going to end up. Every now and then they had shut everything off because they had detected the submarine in amongst us. And it must have really been something to see all that many ships, all sizes. We had little ships that were smaller than a destroyer and what they call a smaller one. They'd go zigzagging through there and then everything would stop and they would drop depth charges. Then we would take off again. Now this was in North Africa. Most people don't know where there was a battle of North Africa. Where we landed, I think, must be that Hitler wanted control of the Mediterranean Sea, and our particular landing was in Safi, French Morocco. That's on the Atlantic side. There was 2 other companies, and us landed in French Morocco and Safi. The rest of them went through the Algiers and Casablanca, landed all along the coastline. There was that French Foreign Legion because France was under German rule at the time, so our enemy was the French Foreign Legion, partly for they were there then. Then there was the Italians, and we were really fortunate. The Germans had just had maneuvers in that area, and they left about a day or so before we got there. And when we landed, I don't know. I couldn't tell you how we were still in the boats going over, for German subs were still circling the seas. We got off from our troop ships by throwing the ropes over the side, and then we climbed down. Some of us had ground swell. I don't know if most of you ever saw ground swell. If you were in the Navy, then you saw it. They would be like 40 feet high, and our ships would go up on there, and the destroyer, we loaded onto the destroyers. The little thing, the destroyer, would be down here, we were up there, and then the 2 would get together. Then Navy sailors would grab a hold of us and pull us up onto the destroyer, and then we would go back up and down, but we didn't lose a man. There was 2 destroyers, L Company on one, and then there was K Company on the other. I was with L Company in the 9th Infantry Division. It was the day when we loaded up supplies onto the beach when early in the morning or at night it was dark, our battleships opened fire. I think we had red or green. Anyway, there was red shells going one way and the green shells were going the other way, and we were underneath the ground in foxholes because from shore they were firing out at the enemy battleships one way and they were firing towards the enemy inland fortifications the other way, so we had to go underneath. At Safi, we had a big breakwater and big long piers because at the piers ships loaded and unloaded, and we went out because they must have had gates or submarine nets or whatever. After that, we got our concealed orders. Our mission was to protect the power plant, and it was kind of dark when we got there. And I don't know how many men I had with me, but that was our mission, so we couldn't let the enemy destroy the power. When we was scouting out the area around the neighboring towns, there was a tent, and there must have been 8 or 10 Arabs in that tent. Well, they didn't know us, and we didn't know them. All we had on for identification was a U.S. flag sewn into our clothes, so they knew what that was for. I didn't know whether to shoot them or what to do with them. We just sort of went in there, and they mumbled and we mumbled. We just kept them from doing any harm. Then we got them all outside, but the other guys were all fighting. We could hear their rifles, but we didn't have to fire a shot. Then there were some fighting further away. We could hear them firing their rifles. It was where the French Foreign Legion was, but I later learned what happened. The officers of the French Foreign Legion knew that they were going to be landing, and they had a big party the night before, so most of the soldiers were so drunk they didn't know what was going on that morning. And then, after we landed, we had to have trenches and foxholes like I told you. The French had trenches already there too, but then the Arabs used that as their own for a resting area, or whatever you want to call it. So the next morning before that, the U.S. commander said if you hear an airplane, it is not ours because we don't have any, not at that particular time. So the next morning, sure enough, here we heard an airplane. We all dove in our foxholes and the commanders just laughed. Yeah, what a mess. But then they dropped bombs and there was steel sheds in which men were hiding in, a ways from where we were, and the plane went right over us. I could see the plane just as clear as possible. It was an Italian. It was real low. You could see just the bottom of it just as nice, and they dropped the bombs, and my best buddy was killed. He was further back. He was our first sergeant from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is approximately 18 miles northeast of Waupun. He kind of watched over me before we ever got there, but then he was killed that day. The shell fragment hit him, and the bombs went off pretty close to us, but close enough that all the shell fragments flew away. But that is what they said. If you hear an airplane, that is not us. So that was our first experience in seeing any action. And after that, we stayed there maybe a month because when we started walking in December, we only had one truck, and the kitchen was loaded in the truck. They had a general of our 47th Infantry, and he said, instead of hauling all of you guys, you walk from now until March. You'll be hardened in, and you'll be ready for action. So that's what we did. And we couldn't walk across Spanish Morocco because they were neutral, so he loaded us in the trucks to get us through there. They wouldn't allow us to walk across Spanish Morocco. And then while we were walking, we heard news about the bazooka and how it came out, and so they said they needed 6 sergeants. They picked up from the regiment, and I happened to be one of the lucky ones. So they loaded 6 of us with a ton of rocket ammunition and a rocket launcher and a DC-3 plane. The 1st Army Division, the Big Red One that had been fighting against Rommel, who was a German and a pretty famous general, fought all the way in Africa against the British, and he was coming. So they loaded us up, and that was the 1st Army Division that was fighting Rommel at the time, and they nearly got wiped completely out because they had the old tanks that had the turret on the side that was stationary, and the Germans just wiped them out completely. And then that's where we went up there with this bazooka that you had to get in about 150 feet of the tank to knock it out. And all you could do was, you had to be sure to shoot him on this flat side of the tank between the racks, on the top and bottom of the tracks, and get it right in through there for the bazooka rocket would go through there. So we got up there and we had to demonstrate how to use the bazooka. They flew us and we stayed overnight, landed one night on somewhere in the desert. We were right in the desert, and the next day they landed a little closer, but they never shut the engines off on the plane. We got out, and as quick as we could get to the ground, the plane was gone. And then there we were with no other transportation, except, I don't know, right at that time I didn't know how we did get from there to, I suppose the 1st Army Division had transportation for us. We loaded our rocket ammunition up, and when we were flying on the DC-3s, we flew through the mountains and valleys between the mountains because they had fighter planes around them. And it was so crook that a fighter plane couldn't fly straight through there, so we flew below the mountain peaks with the DC-3. One time there was such a change in the air pressure that the plane dropped. It dropped faster than the cargo in the plane, and there was quite a crash when the ton of ammunition boxes hit the bottom of the plane. And we thought the thing would go right down through. Then that night we landed. The Arabs were there to help you and sell you something. They told us we weren't that far from a little town where the fighting was. Now, their word for eggs was earfs, and we got to know that. So we followed them and walked to town in the dark and then back to the plains in the morning and had some earfs and wine. And the next morning we took off and went up to the front lines. Then after we got done up there instructing the use of bazookas, we got back to our unit and the transportation officer said, "You gotta get on this train. It's an old 40 and 8. It means 8 mules and 40 men can ride in this little boxcar, 40 and 8. You see that, I think, when you have the American Transportation Legion doing things, there's 40 and 8 signs posted and all around the site, faster travel to different camps. Directors and officers assist us, like the one I was chatting to who told me, "You stay in this car, and eventually it will get you back to your unit." We didn't have much food. A few K rations or whatever, and straw on the bottom of a canteen. I don't know what you used for a restroom because it was just a rail car, unless they had one corner or something like that. We got out of that town, and I don't know how many days it took us on the train. It was cold, too. It was in December and no heat. This is in the winter of 42 from December until March. So first I flew up to the front lines, then back on the rail car, and then I walked over the same territory again to get back to the front lines. But then things got interesting because Christmas was approaching, and we had been up there and we was coming back by train. And we got in Algiers, and I was all by myself because there was only 6 of us, and when each of us was in this boxcar then, of course we were all together, but when I got to Algiers, I wondered where I could go, so I wandered around by myself, and I found a Red Cross sign that directed me to a big, tall, 2 or 3 story Red Cross building or whatever. I visited there a lot and met a Red Cross woman and a few of my fellow wounded servicemen. However, on Christmas Day, I went there, and that was a big, tall, 2 or 3 story building, and there was a Red Cross woman, and she told me that I could spend the night there, so that's what I did, slept on the marble floor. That was Christmas night. The next day I went back and found the train and then got it and went back. Afterwards we hooked up with the outfit. That was quite an experience before we could ever go fighting. Then in March we joined the British Army, then we had British rations to live on. So that's when my division joined the fighting in North Africa. We were under Bradley, General Bradley, in Alexandria, Egypt. But fighting was just as bad as there any other place. We lost lots of men. That's when I got the Bronze Star. We lost one whole battalion to the Germans. Must have been just like a mountain pass, and then to let them walk into there, and that's the last they ever saw of that bunch of men. It was Kasserine. It was right in that area. That scuffle took up until Mother's Day of 43. Yeah, we got out of Tunisia and loaded onto the boats and went to Sicily. Anyways, at Tunisia Bizerta, there was a lot of soldiers that didn't want to give up. I suppose they were German soldiers, and they just walked out into the ocean there off the beach, and airplanes were just strafing them back and forth. There was thousands of soldiers in Tunisia Bizerta, so that was what they did after we had captured Tunisia. They walked right in, and it was awful. The slaughter. The Germans didn't want to give up, but the Italians, they gave up by the thousands. Then we went from there to Palermo, Sicily, and that night at Palermo we got bombed all night long. I don't know how they missed our boat. There were ships burning. Then they had I can't think of the name, little ships that laid smoke screens. They tried to keep the fire from showing from up above. We survived that one. Then we landed at the coast, so we got off the Devil and pushed up there, and that was the strategy for fighting in Sicily. Then we had Berlin Betty. She was the propaganda gal from Germany. She knew every move that we made. She'd come over the radio. She'd tell us where we were and where we were going. She'd say, "Don't think you're going to win. You're getting paid in pounds just to land troops in England." You see, she knew we were going to England. After we took Sicily, we were waiting right on the airport in case they were needed in Italy. We were right there and eventually was ready in an instant. We could get on a plane and fly into Italy. When everything ended there, we were all sent into England. Then we knew what the next thing was. If you all were wondering, I wasn't involved in D-Day. I had mumps about a month or so before that, so I was in the hospital. That saved me. Our unit was in D-Day, though, and most of them had trouble coping with what had happened that day, for they lost a lot that day. Because we had experiences in landing before, for had been in Sicily and other places, we were in the backup or the reserve forces, so we were not in the initial landing. Then they released me out of the hospital, and the commanders put our reserve forces in tents out in the country. Eventually, we re-entered the fighting. There was lots of reception centers, or whatever you call it, and we could go there, and then they would fly us over to France, to St. Lo, which was a town our unit had just taken, and now they had gone up to Cherbourg, France, and then they were on their way back to St. Lo, so the plane landed near St. Lo and I got off there. Then I got back to my unit. But that day they were flying the planes, our planes, and they were bombing the Germans. They didn't have the means we do today, but they'd put markers out so the airplanes would fly in and drop smoke bombs where the markers were placed, which was where the bombers should drop the bombs. Well, that day we had a good strong wind coming inland, and where they landed me, the smoke was going over us and went all the way back to our supply regiment. And they were, our planes, bombing our own men and even getting our headquarters. So I had trouble getting over that horrifying situation. After I hooked up with my unit in St. Lo, I got to be in charge of my platoon. It only had a few soldiers left, so I requested for some new ones. My request was granted, so the new boys went all the way to St. Lo from Normandy, and I led my unit up to Cherbourg and back down to St. Lo, and that's where I met up with our regular 9th Infantry Division and the 47th, my own company and my own soldiers that were under me. A few of them had been killed up in Cherbourg, but there were some more on their way. That's where I got under General George S. Patton. There we loaded on tanks. We rode on the outside of tanks, and he just said, "With your blood and my guts, we can do anything." So we did. We went through France. They said we had more German soldiers behind us than we had in front of us. We just cut a swath right through there. He was a good leader. He was some fighter. They said at one time, probably all of you heard it too, that he stopped the ambulances and said his tanks had to go through. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. I imagine it was, because the ambulances were in his way, so he told them to get out of the way and let his tanks through. So then in July is when we got to the Meuse River. Afterwards, we went through France and Belgium, and that was an awful thing to see, because we'd go through these towns. They had an American flag and a German flag. So when the Germans were in town or went through town, they're all waving the German flags. Then if the Americans came through, they were all waving the American flags. We had lots of skirmishes there with bombings or shelling. Then we got from France to Belgium and to the Meuse River, separating Belgium from Germany, and we crossed the Meuse River, and that's when I got hit. Big shells from the Siegfried line could reach us then, so that's when the thought of my life ending really hit me, and I thought that was the end of it for me. But I was tended to as we crossed the river in that boat, and then we landed to some higher ground, and there were some trees. Whether the shells hit the trees or they were trapped with time bombs set off to go off or what, we had just did something that we were told, which was to never bunch up. So there was 4 or 5 of us. We got a trench or a foxhole dug so we could sit and put our feet down. I think there were 4 or 5 of us. Anyway, they were all killed except me. The Germans pounded our positions with shells, and my best buddy died there. So after that, my whole left side was all full of shrapnel, and there's still some tiny pieces of shrapnel in there to this day. I consider it a little lucky that the shrapnel didn't hit any vital organs, as the medics told me. I spotted some more that were injured, but they could walk. Then the officer said to me, "Can you remember where we crossed the river?" I responded yes, and he ordered me to take these 2 wounded men with me and to see if I can find where I crossed. And if I managed to do so, then I'd find a first aid station and the medics there would get us back to the field hospital. I was pretty good that way about remembering. I could always remember directions and where to go. I don't remember how we got back to the river and just how we got back across. There must have been a boat there because I remember waking up on a boat and the 2 guys I got back with. I had 1 guy on each arm during the hike back to the river. We're older fellers. And when I got back to the first aid station, or maybe they called it the army hospital, they put me on a stretcher because I had an ankle that was injured and shrapnel in my body. In the field hospital, they started operating on taking all the shrapnel out of my body. Then I was on a stretcher, and I heard that I had helped the other guys all the way back to the river where I passed out due to loss of blood, and they put me on a stretcher and moved me into the boat. And the 2 took me to the hospital where I stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. Another interesting thing was when we left the field hospital, we had to go to England. When we got to Fabroche Hospital outside of Paris, France, there were hundreds of ambulances on this airport waiting. They were all in different lines, and we saw the ambulances on one side of us, we were moving, and then we saw them moving on the other side. We didn't have a driver in ours, so we were just sitting there. And after a while, somebody opens up the back of the ambulance and says, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" Here were we inside this freaking ambulance in which the dumb driver had left us in the row for the Germans. Now we didn't have any clothing on besides an army blanket around our waists, and we didn't have any identification of any kind, but somehow we got back to England. I recuperated in England in July. Afterwards, we trained the troops, in which were mainly recruits from the States and England. Now in December of '44, the winter after D-Day, we were still training troops, but this was right at that time the Battle of the Bulge was going on. After we trained the troops in our unit, they were sent to France to help stop the German counterattack. They fought all the way through to the end of the war. Well, all the way through Germany. It seemed that if the officers needed something done, the first chance they have to get it. That's what our unit we were training was meant to do, be the first responders to the officer's call. Eventually, I entered the 1st Division from Texas. They were the number 1 division and we were in reserve for them. So they were better than my original 9th Division because they were number 1, the Red Arrow or the Big Red One. Our symbol or emblem or whatever had an emerald green circle with a red 1 insignia on the circle, and the red 1 was outlined with white. That's what made us the Big Red One. I forgot to mention that's where all our officers came from to train us when we was in Wisconsin in the States. Yes, the officers that trained us were from the Big Red One in Texas. Anyways, after I entered the reserves of the Big Red One, that's when things must have been winding down or something. The last group, that was something else. Afraid they brought 200 GIs that had been locked up in prisons for just minor things, but they were all prisoners, you know. They brought us those 200 in one group and put them, and they stayed in their barracks, for they didn't stay with us in our barracks, they were in their own. And they had some good old times out there, but they minded pretty good, and we trained them, and they were good soldiers. And when they were all done, the first lieutenant says, "Now you can all take a furlough," and gave them passes to London. And we thought, well, this will be the last time we'll ever see of them. I think all but 1 or 2 of them actually did go and came back. So from there, then we came back to one reception center after another and then came home. Flew home. We were the last plane to come home because they divided us up into plane loads. First Birmingham, England, then we went to Scotland, and Scotland was where the planes left for the States. And they had Quonset huts in Scotland, and each Quonset had just a plane load of soldiers or any troops that were ready to go home. We flew back. The nurses and officers, if they had rank over us, could bump us, and then they could go, and of course everyone gradually got bumped, and then got put into a different plane. So eventually there were only 13 of us left, and we'd been there for a few weeks. However, a few days later we leave on a big 4-engine plane. We would just jump from Scotland to Iceland or Greenland because we stopped at each one of them when we needed fuel. But there was only 13 on the great big 4-engine thing, and they said that was the last plane that was flying out of there and no more would come back. However, the war was still going on in Japan when I returned home, but after we dropped the 2 atomic bombs, I knew like the rest of our country that the war was over. And it was because I remember going to the theater and watching Movie-Tone News film strip about the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan, and then they showed Japan surrendering to us on one of our naval vessels. Afterwards, in my point of view, our whole country went wild with celebration. All the streamers, the booze, and the cheering of families. As for me, I was just glad that awful hell of war was over. But yeah, I'm still classified as disabled, 20% or whatever. I had a few pieces of shrapnel right in the bone of my ankle, but I'm still breathing. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to my experience, and I hope you all, who took your time off to listen to this, especially all the other veterans like myself, have a very nice day. My name is William Jennings Arnett, and I live in West Virginia. I'm 84 years old, having been born on July 19th, 1917. I was in the Tank Destroyer Unit, I guess you could call it an armored unit, and we were attached to the 5th Infantry Division, and later on to the 26th Infantry Division during World War II. I would eventually be discharged as a first private class, but I had other ranks during my several years of service. However, that is the way I was discharged when it came to my service. Most of the training I underwent was in the United States, and then we went to Ireland, from Ireland to England, and from England to France. I was in Normandy, North France, the Bulge, and Germany, and then on to Czechoslovakia, which was where we were when the war ended. When I went into the army, it was a draft for 1 year, and I enlisted to get my 1 year over with. That never happened, for I got it over in 5 years. I was living in Clarksburg, West Virginia at the time of my service, and I wanted to get that year out of the way so it wouldn't be hanging over my head that I had to leave my job. If you're asking as to why I picked the Army, I had no particular reason, I just did. I had and still don't have anything against the Navy or Marine Corps, but the Army is just where I went. Anyways, my first 3 days we were sent to, well, we ended up going to Fort Russell, Texas. It is roughly in the El Paso area, and the first haircut I got was, well, the barber laid a thin comb flat on my head and then cut everything that was sticking up. He did that with almost everyone that was drafted or joined the service. I knew some people that entered the service with me, but they never ended up in the same company I was in, and we were soon separated. At the training camp we were at, it was hot. Even in January it was hot, for that hell was desert country, and the buildings or barracks were all built of adobe, so they were very cool and nice that way, but the parade ground where all the recruit work was being done was hot and sandy and dusky. I had my fair share of the mess-ups, which put me on KP duty. Now you might be thinking, wasn't KP duty illegal? And the answer is yes. By hell it was. But they did use KP as a punishment duty. It was only issued to you usually if you messed up some way or the other. The only thing I guess I really learned at camp was to load a mobile gun at the orders of a tank commander. That's what they put on my recommendations to take to civilian life anyway, of what I learned. But I learned generally everything. Take all the rifles and machine guns and everything, take them clear apart and put them together again, time and time again. The instructor was very good at their duty. I had one sergeant at our group. He was a bit of a chow hound himself, and when we were on parade and it came time for the noon meal, he would march us down in the field and then leave us at detention, and he would walk over to the door of the mess hall, and he would holler over to us, "Fall out." That left him first in line. After camp, we were trained in 155mm howitzers, and we went with them to fire at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. When we got there, they had a ton of guns. We mainly had a lot of 37mm cannons, and they even handed a handful of rocks to some of us, which caused a ton of laughter in our unit. Eventually, when we came back, they decided to turn all the anti-tank companies around and make them into a tank destroyer unit, at which time we were issued half-tracks with 75mm guns on them, which we learned to use. After we learned about our new half-tracks, we went to Camp Bowie, Texas, in Brownwood, a town of about 5,000 and 15,000 soldiers there, so you figure about how much fun the town was. And we went there to Camp Pickett, Virginia, where we were trained for landings for when we were going to go to Africa. For some reason or other, they called us back and we were sent. I never did understand what went on there, and from Pickett we went to New York later on and Fort Dixon, Camp Shanks, and we left there from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and from there we went to Ireland. When we embarked from Ireland, we were a part of an enormous convoy. There were small aircraft carriers, real small ones, but they were loaded with airplanes all over the decks so they couldn't fly off them. There was a battleship with them, and I think 2 cruisers or 3. Also, there was a bunch of destroyers. Then all the other ships were oilers, freights, and troop ships. Our ship had about 25,000 soldiers on it, and unfortunately the motor went out, and of course the convoy went on. They can't wait for you, and then we were there overnight worried sick, for we were in the submarine area. However, the next morning they got the motor fixed and we caught up with the convoy. But the motors broke down again and we had another night of the same thing. I began to think that maybe this wasn't all fun. Just before we reached Ireland, I began looking off the balcony of our vessel at night, and at times I could see torpedoes coming along the side of our ship. Now we knew Northern Ireland was under the control of the British, and we landed at Belfast. Most of us were relieved that we were finally in Ireland. We got there in October, and after a real rough North Atlantic crossing, for the North Atlantic in the fall is not the best place to be, and we were there till about April, and from April of 44 we went to England, and we were in England until we went to France for the big invasion of France that we all call D-Day. We landed at Utah Beach, but it was after most of the division was inland, but I'd say maybe 10 miles. But from the time we got there, it was about a month before they were to break out the bridgeheads, and that was when the Normandy campaign ended, after the breakout. Anyways, when we landed at Utah Beach, we came in pretty close because there wasn't any fighting right on the beach then. It was inland about, maybe 5 or 6 miles. Then when we got there, we stayed where we first got off, and we could see there the night like heat lightning. But what it was the artillery. And it was continuous, and it was all night long. It didn't worry me any because I knew I would never get hurt. The next day we moved up and into a field. One of those Normandy fields, and there were some crows there. We met the man who owned the farm, and he came in and got his 2 cows out. I said we were not going to steal his milk or anything, so we left them alone. He knew what he was doing, but I didn't know why he was moving them. I found out a little later when they started showing us. Now the next day was a nice warm sunny day. It was fairly quiet in our area, and I was sitting under a tree. Didn't have any duty right then, and I heard this shell coming in. And I knew, although I had never heard one before, what it was, and I rolled over to my side and it exploded, and I jumped up to run for a foxhole. Now, I didn't know that Germans shot more than 1 shell at a time, and there was another one right behind it that was covered up from the sound of the first one going off. And when that one exploded, it jarred me real bad, and I was completely numb all over. I couldn't feel anything. And I jumped into the foxhole and I looked down, and the back of my hand was all covered in blood. Since I couldn't feel anything, I had to feel my hand to see where I had been hit, but I couldn't feel any place where it was torn or anything. And I tried to realize that maybe I brushed my hand against my leg, and I felt that leg and I was all right. And then I saw the blood was running off my nose, and that really scared me because I didn't know how much of my face was gone. But I got out of it pretty good. I must say I've never felt more lucky in my life. Now, we were usually with the infantry wherever we were assigned a mission. We weren't at the very front of the infantry, but we were real close to them, and at night there was a tank battalion, as well as a tank destroyer that was assigned to each regiment. The tanks would pull out and go maybe about 3 or 4 miles at night, but whenever they would start their motors up, the Germans would start shelling us, and we had to stay there all night. I thought maybe I would get in a tank corps and get out of this stuff, but during that time my requests were turned down, so I was still in the tank destroyer unit. Now, in combat theory, the tank destroyers were supposed to be largely a defense element against German tanks, but they ended up being exactly what General Patton said. The only way to fight a tank is with a tank. So we ended up with a regular tank with a 90mm gun, on which it is an excellent tank, and much better than the regular tanks the main armored units were using. After we received our tanks, we received a symbol for them. It is a tiger or a panther biting or eating a tank up. It was a mock go, seek, strike, and destroy kind of thing. Now, when we went inside those beasts, there were lots of very flammable lines of oil and gasoline, as well as ammunition that was ready to either be fired or blown up. We had both inflammable and armor-piercing rounds. It is not a very comfortable place to be. Very warm. It is not very cold in the winter. One of my biggest fears was that the turret hatch was almost always open, and that sometimes caused a little trouble because it was just big enough for a bomb to fall into it. Now, you might be thinking the bombings of World War II were mostly inaccurate at this time, but we didn't know what the German bombers were like. Anyways, when we crossed the Rhine River, we were out in the middle of the river on one of those pontoon bridges, which was just wide enough for the tracks on our tank, and a German Tu-62 jet bomber came and tried to bomb the bridge out. And I thought, this is a nice place to be in the middle of the Rhine River. But, fortunately, they didn't get us. Once we crossed the Rhine River, the casualties really began to mount. There were several, actually. I can't tell you how many. The first soldier was killed by a shell while he was on sentry duty, and he was trying to relieve us for shut-eye, but then the shells came down. Everybody was then scared to death, and they didn't know what they were doing. And if you were moving around at night, it is very, very dangerous because you never know what you're going to run into, and it almost happened to me later on. More casualties occurred when we simply went to line up to get our meals. We had our kitchen trucks with us, and that caused us to get pinned in there because we got all in a line to get our mess kits filled and the shells started coming in. And of course, that was the end of the meal. And the next day we did it again, and the same thing happened again. We then decided we would fool the Germans by switching our meal time from 12 o'clock to 11, so we got in line and the shells came again. Now, we didn't realize it, but the Germans were watching us. They could see what we were up to. When we got a bunch of guys together, they made the shelling worthwhile. They would let us have it. And I don't remember too much about meals, but those first couple of nights were one of the few warm meals that were much better than K rations or C rations. That's the only thing I remember now about the cooking, because we weren't around the kitchen trucks very often. But when they came later on, we went down to the truck to eat, and the cooks, and one time this mess sergeant had found a small keg of Calvados, and when we went down, it looked like they had all been shot. They're all down in the back of the truck, and the Calvados is what they kicked in alcohol to get the drinker easily drunk, so it was dangerous. We had late in the spring of 44, or anyhow, the 5th Division of the 15,000 officers and men. There was about a dozen that would be allowed a week's furlough in Paris, and anybody would give his right arm for it. And my platoon lieutenant got one of them, but he found out later that day that we were going on attack the next morning, and he wouldn't go because he wanted to stay with us, his men, and I've admired the man ever since. The lieutenant was a man named Muggy, a young Iowa boy from German parentage. He survived the war, but did have a little nervous spell once. He would have the habit of, if we were going into a small town or something, getting on a hill and look it over to see what it was before we got in it. One time, he was out looking at one of these towns and someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was a German, but instead of killing him, he handed him his rifle and surrendered to him. So Muggy took his gun and went back and put a call in for the NPs to come and get him. He sometimes thought, what if the guy hadn't wanted to surrender? What if he had just stabbed me with a bayonet or a knife? That got him kind of nervous, but overall he was really nice. Anyways, most have asked me if I saw many French citizens, and to be honest, I hardly ever saw them. If they could, they would leave the area of battle, but we occasionally ran into some a few times. However, the only time I was in real contact with any of them was when I ran into a Frenchman that had escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Reims, France. He asked me and the crew of our tank where he was in France. He was scared because he needed help to get back home, so we told him where he was, and with the information, he managed to go back to his home that day. He invited our tank crew over, for he and his family, consisting of his friend, his wife, and his brothers, who were French soldiers, were having a big party. Now we were sitting there, and they were giving us wine and everything, and we were having a ball. We would offer him a cigarette, in which they were very valuable, but he wouldn't take it, but boy, his wife, who wasn't drinking that much, did take it. When we went to leave, 2 guys from our team got behind me, and I looked at them and said, "Boy, you kissed me on the mouth and you were on the floor." Of course, they touched cheeks, it was all right, but the rest of the gang wanted to see what would happen to me before they tried it. Another time I saw a group, the only time I saw a group of Frenchmen, they had too much to drink. They had one of those wheelbarrows with a long wooden box on it, and they were giving me a sign by drawing their hands around their throats and saying, "La Boche, La Boche." They were going out to bury whatever or whoever was in the box. Now, the only family I had was a sister that I kept in touch with and a mother. Fortunately, I wasn't married at that time. My mother would get a letter from me, and then they would get one. The next one would be the one that I had written before the first one, or she might go 2 or 3 weeks and get none at all, and I wrote her every week. But then she might get 3 or 4 of them at one time, but she was not very worried about it. As for me, I did feel stressed, but not all the time. An example of why I was stressed is because after a while, one realizes that his chances of survival in this war were getting dimmer all the time, and you do know that you can only be missed so many times. That was probably the main reason why I was stressed. Now, when it comes to other letters like newsletters, I didn't see any newspaper people ever. However, we would get a paper occasionally at Stars and Stripes, which had 3-day-old news because they figured after 3 days you could publish it because the Germans would have known anything by then. Anyways, after we saw the 2 groups of Frenchmen, we went through Luxembourg, and one of our crew members, a boy from Tennessee to be exact, observed people leaning along the edge of a shop of some kind, but what caught his eyes was a sign on the window that read BIER, so we knew we were pretty close to Germany. He asked, "Parlez-vous François, oui? Have you got any cognac?" So we were close to Germany, and you can picture the excitement we felt as we moved towards the border. But what none of us knew was that This was all in the German plan for a Bulge counterattack in which we now know today as the Battle of the Bulge. Now we entered Germany a few days before the opening assault and were at Santa Ladder, attached to the 5th Infantry Division when the battle broke out. As I read through the Stars and Stripes paper, I found out that soldiers up north of us were really getting pounded. That's when I first realized that the Bulge was a serious attack, and I was feeling really sorry for them. At one point, somebody found a deck of cards. We got 3 other guys to play bridge, so we played in the basement of a wrecked house. There wasn't a whole house in the whole town that was all in one piece. We were down in the basement, and the ventilation was very good with lots of light, and we were having a good time playing bridge, until a shell hit just south of us, and then about half a minute later a shell hit up just north of us. It made the observers get the artillery ready and then the target right on, and it's amazing how they were able to retaliate so quickly, for they were bracketed by the shelling. Anyways, we kept on playing because there was just no place to go, and I don't think anybody knew what their cards were, but fortunately, no more shells landed close to the basement we were playing in. We were real lucky, for the rest of the shells that landed were about 100 yards back. The next day we were attached to the 26th Division and headed for the same place there in Luxembourg, and by the time we got to Luxembourg is when all of the snow started. We were also linked up with the 4th Armored Division when we got to Luxembourg, so we were now with 2 divisions, which made our numbers grow extremely high. We did have to sleep in the snow because we usually like to sleep inside the tank, but when steel gets real cold, it is colder on the outside, and it's warmer laying in the snow than it was inside that tank, but we slept under the tank in the snow. On Christmas Day, the officers sent an even amount of turkey up. At the time, we were staying inside a house in Luxembourg at the time, and the lady there cooked our turkey for her kitchen, and her family was glad to get rid of it. There were 3 of us staying in the house because the family had invited us to sleep there on their floor because it was so cold outside, and we sure did appreciate it. After that, the lady cooked the turkey inside the stone-type ovens where you fill them up with wood and feed them that way, and we really had a good Christmas dinner in the middle of a real bad situation. It was very unusual, but a nice experience. Well, Christmas was short-lived, so we kept going forward, and, well, you really don't know how a battle is going. All you know is what is going on around you and what little area you are in. You don't know whether you are winning or losing, but I guess if you are retreating or going backwards, then you are losing. However, that is only a little part of it, but you keep doing what you have to do. Now I had no leave, so I was in the Bulge the entire way through, and all I can say is that it was just a matter of going back and attacking in a different place. So we went to a place called Bastogne and kept going. We eventually broke through the Bastogne, and then we entered Germany, and from then on it was mostly a matter of time before we reached Berlin. No, I don't know the casualties of the Battle of the Bulge. It is not something you've counted anyhow, because the only thing you did count was your friends that were left. Now, we were part of the drive to Berlin, and instead we were set to attack Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and they called the attack off. That was when they realized something big was coming up when they did that, and the next day they announced that Hitler was dead, and the German generals were preparing to surrender to the Allied forces. Now that date is one I'll never forget. It was May the 8th, 1945, the end of the European War. There wasn't any of the unusual celebration you see in film strips of the States at all. In Europe, it was just kind of a sigh of relief more than anything else, and unbelief, too, that the war was actually over. About the only reaction I had is when we went into the house before we were relieved, somebody said, "Well, we don't have to keep the curtains drawn now for a blackout," and he opened them up. And I couldn't stand for that, people outside being able to see in. Still, that had been 2 years since I had ever seen outside lights. Murphy was the most decorated man. He slept with a .45 under his pillow until he got killed. It gets to you, just like it gets to me. We came back on a ship that was made to handle, I think, 4,500 men, and they were putting 6,500 on them. The ones that were being loaded with that crap ton had to sleep on the deck. Now, they didn't have any of the duties to clean up around the ship. I was really lucky because I got a bunk. More specifically, I was on the top bunk. Anyways, we left Marseille and went to Norfolk. so we were in warm and beautiful fall weather. We eventually rode in a truck to a fort outside of Baltimore at Fort George Meade. I was discharged from there. They had sent me home on a furlough, and I was home for about a month before I was officially discharged because they couldn't discharge everybody at the same time because they would call you back and say the numbers were too great. But eventually they would call you back when they could handle you. A few months after the war, I got myself a job and began going to work. I was working outside the factory where I used to work. Now there was this noise that sounded very much like a shell coming in. Although the war had been over for a few months, I still hit the dirt. Just an automatic thing, and I had reoccurring bad dreams in which my wife kicked me to wake me because I was moaning and groaning and everything. Now, that went on very heavy for about, 15, 20 years, and once a year I'd usually have one of those dreams. Anyways, that's my experience in World War II, and I want to thank you all for taking your time to listen to this, for you have shown me how much a serviceman means to our country of the United States of America. My name is Kenneth Delaney. I was born and raised in Historia, Long Island City, New York. Got married May 16, 1953, and have 5 children, 2 girls, 3 boys, and 15 grandchildren, 8 girls and 7 boys, and they all know Grandpa's war stories, especially about D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge started December 16, 1944. I was still in the hospital from the wounds that I received in the Hurtgen Forest battle back in November. That was my second wound. Anyway, the German army, about 25 divisions, opened up an artillery barrage on the American front in Belgium. It was held by 2 crack divisions, American divisions, and 1 armored division in reserve. The 2 American divisions had been badly beaten from the Hurtgen Forest and the Hurtgen Forest battle around the end of November. I was recuperating from the wounds received in that battle at a hospital, like I said, in Liège. Then on December 17th, the hospital staff informed us that if you can walk or crawl, you have to go back to your division headquarters as soon as possible. I fought with the 1st Infantry Division, 18th Regimental Combat Team on D-Day, Omaha Beach, in the Hurtgen Forest battle. I got back to my outfit on December 18th and I left the hospital. On December 19th, the next day, I again joined my regiment. I traded my walking cane in for an M1 rifle and some hand grenades. The company commander told me I had to take over the 3rd squad when I got to the outfit up in the front. When I reached the foxholes where the companies were, I found the 1st platoon. They were already in position on the front lines, so the platoon sergeant showed me where the 3rd squad was. Now usually the squad has 12 men. My squad, the 3rd squad, had about 8 riflemen, and they were all new replacements and no combat experience. Finally, got orders to move toward enemy position. We advanced about 8 or 10 miles through the woods and a couple of small villages which had to search every house for German soldiers, but both villages were empty. Then about an hour later, we were back in a wooded area again, and that's when all hell broke loose. The 1st platoon ran into a machine gun nest. Besides carrying a rifle and hand grenades, I also carried a radio set called a walkie-talkie, and my lieutenant told me to radio for tank support because the platoon was pinned down. We were pinned down for at least an hour, still without tank support. I wasn't too worried because we had pretty good backup with the 2nd and 3rd platoons on our left and right flanks. I had been carrying 6 hand grenades which came in pretty handy. Before we silenced the machine gun fire, 4 men in our squad were wounded and 3 were killed. Later that day, they gave me 4 replacements. On December 20th, 21st, the company moved out and advanced about 12 miles further into Belgium. My squad, the 3rd squad, and the 1st squad ran into 2 German squads. They saw us running towards them and decided to surrender, all 19 of them. Then on December 22nd, we started out with another mission. I noticed a farmhouse in the distance, and as we got closer, I noticed some activity around the house. Then I signaled the platoon to lay low and take cover. I signaled with my left hand above my head when I felt a sting in my left arm, a very hot sting. We took the farmhouse about half an hour later, taking 3 more prisoners. I felt my left hand wet and sweaty when I pulled my jacket sleeve up, took my glove off. I saw blood on my arm starting, on my arm all over my watch, and then my arm started to hurt. The field medic took me back to the field hospital, which was about anywhere to 7 to 10 miles. We went by Army Jeep, and then back to the hospital doctor, said it was a small bullet went straight through my arm. So I stayed there 3 weeks in the field hospital and then went back to my company to combat duty again, and was wounded again, but slightly. One thing we were told was to never take a path that is already made in the woods or the forest for fear of landmines being planted there. But on January 28th, we started to move out for the next village at about 8 a.m. The village was about 3 or 4 miles down the road, so we decided to cross an open field, and guess what? It was mined. Our platoon leader, Lieutenant, I forgot his name, decided to call for a Sherman tank, but the radio I had, walkie-talkie, was not working to tell them what the situation is, and he called. "Hey, Delaney, you gotta go back to the company headquarters and tell them what happened to get a tank up here." To make a long story longer, we got the tanks to spray the minefield to blow up what mines were in there, and there were some. Then about an hour later, we moved out toward the woods again. So being the first scout, naturally I was the first man in the woods. It was a pretty thick wooded area, almost a forest, but not quite. So I decided to take the path that I saw. Didn't take long to find one. The path was an incline that led up the main road that we found out later were going to take anyways, which were held by German troops. That were holding the road, so we were told. The road had to be taken so our convoy could get through with some supplies to our troops in different areas. I was nearing the top of the incline near the road when I noticed a pile of logs on the crest of the hill. So I turned to my second scout and said, "It looks a lot like a machine gun nest." So he looked at me and said, "If it is, then we should be dead." I hand-signaled back to the first and second squad to lay low until we found out it was, and thank God it wasn't, when 3 machine gunners jumped out from behind the log with their hands up and said, "Please don't shoot, we surrender." And I guess we lucked out again. On May 8th, 1945, the war ended. We all got drunk. But I was in combat from the end of January to February, March, April, until the end of the war, and we had a big party that day. But one more story on patrol we had in Czechoslovakia on May 11th, 1945. We went into, I believe it was before we got into Pilsen, with the trucks with loudspeakers to tell Germans the war had ended, that it's over, and we had 1 soldier with us that went through 7 campaigns without a scratch. I don't know how he'd done it, but we ran into a machine gun nest. They fired on us, and he caught a bullet, and it was his first and last wound. He died that day, and here is a guy that went through the whole thing, and when the war ended, it was how he ended. We got the 4 German soldiers with a .50 caliber mounted machine gun on top of our truck, and that was our last combat with the enemy. Anyway, the war was over for most of us, but it was also over for him. Just want to say one more thing. Thank you for listening to my experience. My name is Donald Patrick Finn, and I'm 87 years old. I served in World War II in the United States Navy. I enlisted in August 1939, and I entered the Navy because I thought that branch might be a good career choice, and I really wanted to see a lot of the world. Boot camp was all right. Early mornings, lots of drills, and I was usually late to bed. I think it was about 6 weeks of drilling and learning to shoot a rifle. Then I really didn't know where we would go from there. After boot camp in San Diego, I was assigned, I think it must have been in early November of 1939, with several of my boot camp buddies to be aboard the aircraft carrier, Enterprise, which was based in Pearl Harbor. I was serving between the area of Midway Island and Pearl Harbor. However, we were mainly in Pearl Harbor, and I had a tour of duty just previous to December the 7th at Midway Island, which is quite a few hundred miles west of Pearl Harbor. Just before we entered the war from the Pearl Harbor attack, I achieved the rank of Aviation Machinist, 3rd class. Most people asked if I saw combat in my early days of service, but I didn't hear or see a single shot fired until December the 7th, 1941. There wasn't any combat until then, but on that infamous morning on December 7th, a lot of guys had already gone to breakfast, and a lot of the guys had not. Now, I was one of the guys that missed his breakfast, so while I was looking out the window toward where our hangars were, fully intending to go to breakfast, I watched a plane that was diving in the vicinity of the hangars where our planes were caged. Suddenly, we heard a loud explosion, and when the plane pulled out of its dive, we saw the insignia of the Japanese Air Force, and that's when all the fear started among those of us who were still in the barracks waiting to go to breakfast. We never went to breakfast, but we did go to the mess hall, but there was no breakfast being served because there were a lot of injured men being set on tables so medics could perform treatments. Also, people were coming in from ships that had already been hit, so we never had breakfast. A lot of people came to help, and it kind of became a mess in there. I was on Port Island, so it was some time, maybe as much as a half an hour, while the mess hall was full of people coming in from ships, first aid and so on. And officers letting us know that pretty soon we better get down to wherever our battle stations were. And of course, our battle stations were way down at the other end of the island where the seaplanes were housed, so we began to leg it pretty fast. I don't think we even looked at the Arizona when we started to run for it. We just knew later that the Arizona had been hit and sunk. But anyways, we could see some of the planes that had already dropped torpedoes and the planes that were making torpedo runs. We could see them when we were running down the hangar where our planes were. And when we got there, we saw that a bomb had gone through the roof of the hangar where the planes were and blown off the hangar door, which is about 30 feet high and twice as wide, a huge hangar. The concrete structure where the planes were supposed to be anchored had collapsed, but several planes had been outside the hangar and they were hit by flying concrete and bursting bombs. Then we were put to work trying to clear some of the debris while the battle was still going on. There were still planes coming down the channel making torpedo runs on the ships that were in the harbor. When the first wave ended, I don't remember how long it lasted, maybe an hour, there was a long pause, and then there suddenly was a second wave. So we were on the channel, kind of narrow, that comes in from the sea to Pearl Harbor, and one ship was trying to make its way out. It got away from its anchorage and wanted to get put to sea, but it never made it. It got stuck in the channel just opposite from where our hangars were. I think the ship was the West Virginia, but I'm not sure now. Along sometimes in the afternoon, the attack had finally ceased and lunch came around. I don't remember what it was. Sandwiches, I guess. And we were at the hangar for the rest of the night. We didn't go back into the barracks. Surprisingly, nobody in our unit at least was wounded or dead. There were no casualties, none. We were, for the time, not on a ship at all because all the ships were back from where our planes were, as much as a quarter mile or more. And at night, when it was dark, there were some planes, of our own planes as I recall, coming in for landings, and they would have been one of the carriers that had been out to sea. There were no carriers parked in Pearl Harbor at the time of the bombing, and when some of those planes came in, some of the people, our people with machine guns, got itchy fingers and shot at them, but they didn't hit them. So that is actually what ended Pearl Harbor attack that day, I guess. I got a citation as a member of the force that went out from Pearl Harbor a few days after Pearl Harbor. We went out to the Pacific areas in Australia and the Dutch Indies. One was the operation of the island of Ambon, and another was at Saipan. It was a unit citation, and the reason for the unit citation was constantly daily patrols, long hours, and a terrific attrition of aircraft. With the 12 or so planes that went out, there weren't any that came back. It was tough going on most patrols. There was as much accidents as planes that were shot down. But now that I think about it, in fact, only a couple of planes were shot up, and a couple were bombed in hangars. The beginning of the war for us was awful, for we were constantly on the run, due to our focus being in Europe. Anyways, that was what the unit citation was for, and it was given after we were back in the States. We were stationed in Whidbey Island in Washington, and reforming when we received it. Then we ended up in the Aleutians, but the unit citation was for the operation in the Pacific in the area of Australia and Dutch Indies. When we got to the Aleutians, I received a new pilot, Lieutenant Senior Grade Thomas Moorer. who later became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps after the war. I don't know whether he is still living or not. We were then stationed in San Francisco for a few weeks, and that was a very pleasant place to be. That was between tours of duty to the Aleutians and back. We were also stationed in Washington State at Whidbey Island, so we were moving back and forth. 2 tours of duty in the Aleutians, a long-time waiting assignment, which was very pleasant in San Francisco. I remember when we were coming back from, I believe it was the 2nd tour of duty, we were ending up the 2nd tour of duty in the Aleutians and flying from Attu, where we had been there 3 weeks patrolling as the infantry was mopping up the Attu. Almost all of the Japanese soldiers were either killed or ended their own lives, and when we were coming back, our plane developed engine trouble over one of the islands on the way back to Dutch Harbor and crashed due to a mechanical malfunction, but we were close to the beach. The thing was that a gas line left one of our engines starved and we got close to the beach, so we put out the life raft and put provisions in it to go ashore when the plane ran on the rocks and tore the bottom of it and dumped us in the drink. Then we landed on the beach with no supplies, no food. We were at one end of the island, and I think there was a radio message sent out so that the people back in the Dutch harbor knew what happened to us. I didn't know it, but I guess the officers, pilots, Lieutenant Jolly, and I don't remember who the other names were. They got instructions to make a forced march from one end of the island, which, 25-30 miles from the point where we crashed, and where a PT boat would rendezvous with us on the other end of the island. So we marched, and we stayed that night on the shore with no food. I guess we marched probably 15 to 20 miles. Now we walked over some pretty rough terrain, and to the spot on the north shore or south where the PT boat was. Now we joined up, and the PT boat was pretty small, so it was crowded and the sea was rough, so it was quite a long ways from this island to the Dutch harbor. Now, that was probably the scariest adventure in the war. Now, I stayed in touch with my family by writing them a couple of times a month, and we would receive cookies, cakes, and letters in return. We also had a couple of leaves. That's the way we stayed in touch, leaves and letters. Usually when I had leave, I would travel from San Francisco up to Chicago on the Amtrak, I think, to visit my family most of the time. I can't count how many leaves I had when I went to see them. I forgot to mention this before, but I had a leave one time and I was driving across country with some of my friends who graduated from the mechanics school in Norfolk, Virginia, where we went from the Enterprise to Chicago. Then I had one leave where I traveled to Idaho, and that's all the leaves I can remember that I had. I also did have 7 or 8 notebooks pretty filled up all the way from December the 7th until the end of the war in 1945. Sometimes there were events that were missing because things for me were too busy these days or my memory would fail me, so that's why those dates didn't get written down. I was discharged from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I knew the government was working on a program for GIs if they haven't been to college already, could go to college and further their education. So I opted to take the government up on that by going through the procedure, and since I had family and folks in Chicago, I had to take location into consideration when making my choice to put in. I eventually applied and started college education at DePaul University in 1945, just a month or so after the war ended. I began the fall term at DePaul University enrolling in a liberal arts program. I graduated in 1950. The war was over in 45. I think it took me an extra 6 months, that's why it was 1950. I graduated in the class of 1950 with a liberal arts degree and a major in English because I wanted to be a journalist. I always thought the same thing about war, which is that there shouldn't be any wars. I would say that I had a checkered career because I tried to do many great things. I was an editor for a lot of companies right after the war, and even before the war they had what they called house organs, and they were done for the benefit of the employers. Some companies were very large, and they had quite extensive staffs just devoted to the house organ, so I did that for a couple of years. I also tried selling, not successful. I also tried with a couple, a man and a wife, who had a marionette show that they took around the country, and I booked the show for grade schools in Indiana and Illinois for a year or so, and one half of the man and wife team died, and that ended the show. After that, I became a reporter for a small-town newspaper, a photographer and a journalist. I was always a little leery when reading or talking about wars. to be darn sure that everyone isn't right or everybody isn't wrong, and there should be a lot more negotiation instead of conflict. Well, I guess if I hadn't gone into the service, I never would have gone to college for one thing, and took a different direction altogether. I would have been out there farming. Not that there's anything wrong with farming, but I changed from being a farm boy to being a city boy, which a lot of people did. I also did a lot more reading about a lot more things than I ever would have done if I hadn't been in the service. I thought I met a lot of good guys in the service and made a lot of friends. Also, I thought and still think that maybe we were all ready for the experience. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed that Veteran Day special. I hope those stories of all the veterans had touched your heart in the same manner it touched mine. I didn't want to censor anything in this video because I really wanted people to understand the sacrifice and the horror that people saw in the face of war. I pray that we never have to go through anything like that ever again as a world population, suppose, but as they say, war never ends, and if there's anything you can learn from this, maybe, at the very least, we can appreciate those who have given and sacrificed everything for our freedoms. And hopefully we can differentiate between certain necessities in life and whether or not they're worth fighting for, and the differences between good and evil, if there really is any. Well, friends, thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed these, perhaps down the road, maybe even earlier than next year, we can get in contact with other veterans and discuss their stories. I appreciate you sticking through this, and thank you guys all so much for the support of the channel. May God bless you and your family and all of the veterans out there that have served us thus far and continue to serve us every day. Good night.